The forms are all in the back of the manual, so you don't, and those forms are for you to take back to your jurisdiction, and we're going to cover those forms a little bit later. The last thing that is not on the, wasn't on the slide, was this section on page 12, and this is really, this section actually identifies specific appendixes that you could have, or you might not have, or might be good recommendations that support this annex. And I'm not going to go into them in depth, because if you don't have these, then you're just going to delete this whole section. But for example, in the city of LA, we have a mass care and shelter annex, and then we have 6 to 7 supporting appendixes to the annex. And I don't know if everybody knows the difference between an appendix, a plan, and an annex, okay? So when you have your emergency operations plan, that's a master plan. It's a standalone plan. That means somebody picking up that plan, if they read that plan from front to back, that's it. They can pretty much, it describes everything in a complete overview, and the reader will be able to walk away and get a good picture. An annex is also a standalone plan, but it may have sections in it that you kind of cut corners by referencing back to another annex or the EOP. But if the reader picks it up, they should be able to read through that plan, and they'll have a sense of what you're trying to describe. An appendix is attached to an annex. In other words, you can't pick up an appendix and read it by itself, and you'll have a clear understanding of the full care and shelter operation, or any operation that you're describing. So for the mass care and shelter annex in the city of LA, because I told you 4 million to 8 million people we could have, we actually have a number of supporting appendices. And so we have a traditional sheltering appendices, a non-traditional sheltering appendices. We have a mass feeding appendix, which just goes strictly into how we're going to mass feed. Because could you activate a care and shelter site where you're only feeding people? Yes, you could have people that remain in their homes and they just need to have some place to go get food and water. Small animal support, that would be your small animal sheltering. Large animal support, a lot of times we've seen in the recent wildfires a lot of movement of horses, equine, so the large animal support. But the only thing you need to know about this section is the language will stand if you have those annexes. You might have to tweak it a little bit, or I'm sorry, appendices. If you don't have them, these are some good recommendations on attachments that you could add, because in a small jurisdiction, do you really need to do in a separate appendix? No. So when we get to the end of the plan, you're going to see we have some attachments. You could actually do some distinct, specific attachments at the end of this plan, which go a little bit more into depth into these breakdowns. When we talk about a traditional sheltering, those are the ones that most of us are familiar. You have a rec and park site. You're maybe sheltering 100 to 250 to 300 people. Those are our traditional shelterings. When we talk about the non-traditional, and we're going to go into them a little bit later on, these are your large, much larger, very unique situations where you may not be able to utilize a established facility site. These are things where you might have people congregating out in an open park. Or maybe you're going to erect a large tent. There's what we call a mega shelter. There's a lot of companies out there right now that you can contract with that will bring in these large tents, you can call shelter in a box, and they will set up these mega shelters for you. And so that's the type of non-traditional soft-sided. And then there's obviously the large stadium type sheltering, which we saw during Katrina. You know, you think of, you know, a massive event where you're talking, you know, 100,000 people, where you might have to put them in a large stadium type event. So, and obviously we know that those are our last resorts, these non-traditional, because the amount of resources and the time and the effort and the support that these type of sheltering sites require is really extensively cumbersome. And so we really, at all times, we really want to move away from those. If you have people that spontaneously go to a park location, you're going to want to try to move them to an established facility as soon as possible. And we'll talk about that. But those are some recommended either attachments. That just means you're going to have a separate 4 to 5 page document. By the way, a checklist, you can do a checklist. A checklist can be used as an attachment. You don't have to write out a full text description. You can, and you'll see we have some checklists in the back. So you could do a checklist, a traditional sheltering checklist, and that would suffice. So that's that section there. And I have to remember not to put the pages up and hit the mic. Thank you. So, okay, so let's move into concept of operations. There's 2 sections in this plan that are pretty extensive and where most of the work in your plan is going to happen. And let me go back up. The 2 sections are concept of operations and roles of responsibilities. And actually, I will say that the concept of operations section, where did it go? The concept of operations section will probably be the most extensive amount of development that you're going to do in this plan. Roles and responsibilities is a large section, but you're going to find that the process to get that information is pretty straightforward, and that tends to be, once you get it up and running, it flows pretty easily. So let's talk about the concept of operations, and we really have 3 slides to go in that. For those of you in our key public safety agencies, you know what I'm talking about when I say command, control, and coordination. What we're going to do here is we're going to start to talk about care and shelter in terms of an incident occurring. So as we move forward through this command or this command, control, and coordination, or the concept of operations, we're going to start to envision flowing through this plan as if an incident happens. Okay. So when we talk about an incident occurring, okay, so let me pull up my concept of operations. The first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to really brief our reader in the plan on some terminology. So if you look at the first section A under concept of operations, it's really just a list of terms that it's a good thing that the reader understands, or in terms of reading the plan, or maybe when we talk about care and shelter operations, it's a good idea that they have an understanding of what that means. So we talk about access and functional needs, disability, it kind of defines those out. The 2 areas in this section that I'm going to kind of point out to you that you'll have to take a look at, and you'll have to determine whether it applies to your jurisdiction is, when we talk about care and shelter sites, I moved away from that mass care and shelter because of the perception. Care and shelter site is any place where you're going to bring people in and you're going to provide them some basic services to mitigate or assist them during a time of threat or hazard. So when we look at our severe heat indexes, which we've all been experiencing over the last couple of years, when we talk about a place where people can go to get away from the heat, because especially our vulnerable populations like our elderly, children, animals, things like that, and those people that don't have air conditioning, the luxury of it, a cooling center or a place to go to cool off is considered a care and shelter site. Okay, because we are going to provide some basic respite from the heat. One of the things we ran into, and this is what I recommend this is a lesson learned for all the jurisdictions, is if you have a cooling center program in your city, then this section is going to apply. Okay. One of the things, though, that we don't go into verbatim is the activation of a cooling center. What triggers that? What are the conditions? Because that should be in an adverse weather annex, or it's going to be written into your EOP if you don't have an adverse weather annex. But what we found is the public got really confused when we talked about cooling centers, and the reason I want to bring it up is because it got to be a big challenge. All public facilities in all jurisdictions are places that the public can go during their normal business operating hours to go to get cool. So what we do in the plan is we reference that. We just basically give a standard language that all city facilities, all public city facilities can be used to go and cool off during normal business hours. And we might put in our city facilities are our libraries, our rec and park centers, and then we have some other facilities. So what we do is we just put in those websites where they can go and they can get the sites, the facility locations, and the hours. When we do our public information campaign about cooling centers, we don't call them cooling centers. We just say that the public can go to the following facilities during normal hours to, to escape the heat, and we just give those websites and they can go. When it becomes an official cooling center are after hours. So a lot of times our Rec and Parks department will extend hours at a Rec and Parks facility. So say they're normally open 8 to 5 and we don't have a good heat recovery at night, in other words, the temperature doesn't cool down, they'll extend their hours to 9 to 10. The hours between 5 and 10, they now become cooling centers. And that public information on that is, the public is informed a different way on that cooling center activation, so that they don't get confused and think that, okay, well, this is a public library, this is a Rec and Parks, and all Rec and Parks and all libraries stay open till these hours. It's very specific to a certain site and the hours that the extended hours. So when we do that public information campaign, our cooling centers are facilities that we may extend the hours on. So how does this apply to you? What point am I trying to make? If in your city you don't extend any hours, you don't technically have a cooling center, you have a location where the public can go to cool off, and those are your public facilities. You're just going to put that straight language in there, and then you're going to just go ahead and refer them to the websites where they can go to find out the hours of operation of your libraries, your Rec and Parks. Now, LA County has cooling centers also across the whole county. Some of those cooling center locations may be in your jurisdiction. Mike, are you raising your hand on that? Oh, okay. I saw your hand back there. Yeah. So anyway, so what we did provide in there is the website for the county locations, and those are open at their hours. In other words, they aren't under the direction of your jurisdiction. So if you don't have a cooling center program, in other words, you don't extend the hours on public facilities to stay open after hours, then all you're going to do is say city facilities are available to cool off. These are the following websites, and you won't use that extended language in there that I have in there for you. Does that make sense on that? Okay, so during periods of high temperatures, the cooling locations may extend the hours of facilities beyond regular business times, and the facilities will be referred to as cooling centers. And see that language on that paragraph? It's the second paragraph down. If you don't have that program, then you're going to delete most of that language, and you're just going to say public facilities are open to escape the heat. Does that make sense? In other words, the language in there right now actually describes a cooling center program. City public facilities open during normal hours. If we extend the hours 2 to 3 hours beyond normal business hours, they become cooling centers. And then the public, it doesn't get any confusion. They know if a site's open later hours, it's specifically a cooling center. Because what'll happen is if you say your public facilities are cooling centers, the public will come expecting that they can stay there overnight. They might bring sleeping bags and stuff like that, and they're not. You're just offering a public facility. It's still a library, it's still a rec center. They can come and be in there, but you're not setting it up for them to come there and just, stay a while as a cooling center into the evening hours. If you extend the hours, then it's no longer a library, it's a cooling center. Does that make sense? It's really about the perception of the public, but definitely you want to have those websites in there. So what I'm kind of getting to is in this section you're going to have to determine it's an either or. Either you have a cooling center program and you can leave most of the language in there. You can leave the county website in there for either situation because they're always available. Or you're going to delete the language and you're just going to make it's public facilities are available. Okay, and you're going to kind of see that there's a couple different sections in this terminology that we kind of do that. But anyway, through the remainder of the terminology, there really isn't a lot that you're going to need to change, but there is one other additional section here that I want to go into, and it's actually the exact opposite of the cooling centers, and that's warming centers. So we know that those public facilities, if they can be used during high heat situations, we can also use those public facilities when it gets really cold outside. And so people can go ahead and go to those facilities and get out from the elements during those very cold winter temperatures that we get or severe storms. Same thing applies. If you don't have a warming center program where you extend hours, then basically you're just going to repeat that city facilities can be, used. Referring, and one of the things with these centers is they're available to everybody. Public facilities during normal business hours are always available to everybody, but the extended hours, the same thing applies. They're available to all people needing to get out of the elements. If you have that severe weather annex, there's a spot where you're going to reference it. And then for the warming centers, you actually have that website that the county provides that gives a list of locations where you can utilize that for warming. Now, again, just like the cooling center, if you don't have that program, we've actually provided language on that. The city does not currently provide warming facilities, but there is a winter shelter program that's available through the Los Angeles, did I write it out? Yes, Los Angeles Homeless Services Authorities. Thanks, Mike. And that program is up and running all the time. So if you don't have that warming center program, I've actually given you the OR language you can use. And you keep that LASA website in there. Okay, so when we talk about, right now we've gotten through the terminology, and now we're going to go ahead and move through a timeline of the incident to kind of get a feel of how we're working through the plan. This plan is written so the reader is actually going to get the feel of, as we're working through an incident, what's happening. And that's what you're describing, this concept of operations. It's kind of the story of how you're proceeding through an incident and the step-by-step processes and those identified roles and responsibilities somebody that was in your jurisdiction, it's that description that they could expect to see if you're activating that care and shelter capability. So when we talk about when the incident happens, we know that first of all, an incident is going to occur, and we're going to have that organization that is going to go ahead and ramp up. But let me go through that. So the first thing that we're going to talk about when we talk about command, control, and coordination is you're going to activate some type of organization that's going to be tasked with the overall management of that incident. And we all know that when we talk about the organizations that most of us are going to be actually working in, it's either going to be a field command, some type of field command, incident command post, unified command post, maybe even possibly an area command, and that's our field command. From now on throughout this workshop, when I talk about field command, that's what I'm talking about, is that organization that ramps up in the field. Or you might activate what we call Emergency Operations Center, okay? And American Red Cross, as a partner agency, also has their own internal procedures, their own command and control operations center, and also their organization that they could ramp up. So when we talk about the authority to activate a shelter, the first thing we do is, you notice what's the first sentence that we write into our plan right off the bat, is this plan and the city is compliant with the National Incident Management System and the Standard Emergency Management System. Heartily recommend that you insert that language in all of your plans at some point. A good place is to do it in the introduction, and I believe it is referenced there. But when we state that, the reader knows that we're actually compliant. And we are matching the state's organizational model for response, and we're also following national guidelines that follow along the national response framework, okay? So one of the things here is under the authority to activate, there's a next place where we reference your policies, your jurisdictional, those codes and authorities that you want to reference real quick. What you'll notice is this is very overarching information, right? Very general. First thing we're saying is this plan is NIMS and SEMS compliant. Second is this plan will describe all the duties and responsibilities that our policies outline. Pretty generic statement. So right away the reader knows, oh, okay, well, you know, if I want to stop here, pretty comfortable. Most people are going to keep reading through the plan, but you've actually established to the reader an understanding that you're working off of general best practices guidance. And that's really important when people are reading through plans, especially when you're getting audited. When we talk about care and shelter activation, okay, one of the things is we could have a couple different scenarios that occur when we talk about a shelter activation. I'm going to stop for a second here because I think we have all of our subject matter experts. Oh, Kathy's not here yet? Okay. Then, you know, we'll do it after the next break. Okay, great. So we could have a couple different situations. A lot of you probably don't know that you could have an incident that occurs in your city where the American Red Cross comes in and activates a shelter, and you might never know about it or be notified about it. So when we talk about the types of situations where you might have a site that's activated, you could have one that the American Red Cross activates. They aren't really, the city is not really going to be working at that shelter. There may be no need for any departments to support that site, whether it's a care and shelter site. And maybe the Red Cross is just going to call you up maybe for some minimal support or resources, but most of the time they don't. They can come and handle that operation solely on their own, with their own resources. So that's one type of situation that you could have. The next one is that you have an incident, we have an incident in the city that's just occurred, and we're looking at that we know that incident has certain aspects of it that for the city, that is actually going to move us into a critical decision situation. For those of you who are very familiar with the incident command system, you'll probably know what I'm talking about by critical decision. But when when all of us look at a threat that's occurred or an incident that's occurred, there are certain aspects of a threat, whether it's through our experience or even when we're first starting out in emergency management, there has to be some way for us to move into this ability to make some very quick critical decisions. And so what we talk about is we talk about triggers about an incident. And triggers are those things that they're guidelines. They're not cut in stone. In other words, we know there's some flexibility in what may trigger us to make a decision to activate. But at least if I'm a brand new emergency manager or I'm a brand new, fire personnel coming in and I have a responsibility, to make these decisions, I can look at what we try to do in plans is we try to offer at least some trigger guidelines. So if I look down at the bottom and I have proposed 3 triggers for you, I actually did a lot of research on triggers. We talk about them all the time in the city of LA, but when I research plans across the nation, there's not a lot of examples that I could provide. But I did draft some potential trigger language for you, and it gives you enough generality that you can pretty much gauge that it still gives you flexibility. But the first trigger would be when the field command or the EOC assesses that something poses a threat. Now we can all pretty much gauge that covers a lot of different situations, but if you know that the public and you have a certain number of people that are going to be affected, then you're going to activate shelters. And if you want, you can kind of gauge what that parameter might be. We know that the American Red Cross a lot of times activates shelters for small numbers of people, but what's your trigger? You might have something like, well, if we've activated shelters, we try to activate shelters in the city of LA for 100 people or more, but we've had 10 people show up to a shelter, okay? And so, you can look at it. Are other jurisdictions activating shelters? Maybe you're going to combine shelters, and you don't need to activate that shelter here. You can activate it in another place. We all know that the proclamation of a local emergency, you're looking at potential sheltering. If we have a proclamation, if this incident is so significant that we've moved to that proclamation, then the sheltering or some kind of provision of human service needs, whether it's just care rather than a sheltering, is going to be most likely the need to activate. And activating in advance of a potential threat. A good example is in the city of Los Angeles, when we have a significant rain event, we had a lot of them last year. The valley gets massive flooding. It's horrible. It gets it gets up to like a foot of water on the local streets. And a lot of times we have potential problems with mudslide areas that have had fires that are moving through. And so if we have a significant rain coming in, we have certain communities that are at risk during a heavy rain. So what we'll do is we'll activate shelters in advance of the rain event in anticipation, and we'll move to do a evacuation warning or advisory before the mudslides if we know there's a significant threat, and we'll move those residents out of that area, and they'll go to a shelter temporarily until that threat has subsided. So that's activating a shelter in advance of something happening. And I know most of you will know those types of incidents. Mudslides is probably the most significant one, especially with the fires that we've had. That's a significant threat. So those are 3 triggers, and it'll be up to you to decide, do those triggers apply to my jurisdiction? If you want to add some additional triggers or you want to change that language, feel free. Throughout this document, you're free to change any language that you want, but we feel pretty much if you stick with a lot of this general language, you'll be okay.
The Red Cross model for opening a shelter is 10 displaced families or 20 individuals. That's the basic bottom line threshold for consideration of opening a shelter. And that's arrived at when you go to an incident or you're at an incident and they determine they don't have another place to go or they don't have the resources to go someplace else. If they have insurance and they can't get a hold of the claims adjuster to get a housing voucher, they don't have family or friends, they're not into couch surfing, or their kids are enrolled in school so they need to stay nearby. So that number is 20 displaced individuals or about 10 households. It's usually not less than that because otherwise it gets a little unmanageable. Because remember, you're potentially taking one of your facilities, whether it's a teen center or a senior center or a community center, and turning it into an overnight shelter. So you really want to use that number of displaced citizens if you're talking sheltering. If for whatever reason public health, law enforcement, or fire needs to evacuate temporarily or longer term, that number is a little bit different. If you're evacuating 5 people and they don't have transportation and there's no place for them to go, that can be your low end threshold. So you have to look at the event dynamics, but also consider your community and your resource base.
Yeah, good. And the reason, and you don't have to put in the number. I'll tell you what the advantage of having a number is. It's mainly for your critical decision makers. We know that if it necessitates, we're going to open up, we may make the decision to do it at a lower number. But at least it gives a guideline to, if you have an incident commander out in the field and they have 2 residents displaced, if you've given them at least a guideline, they're not going to move. And you're going to have some fairly new incident commanders out there that might make the decision, we're going to go ahead and move forward and open up a shelter. And what I'm trying to do is cover all the possible situations. By giving them at least a guideline, they're most likely going to pick up the phone and call somebody before they activate for that, rather than saying, oh, no, I'm opening. But that doesn't mean you won't have that, incident commander that does it. Triggers just give people the ability to set boundaries on critical decisions. And I think you guys know what I'm talking about, but triggers. I mean, there's certain aspects of the disaster that give us clues as to the next thing that we should most likely be moving forward to do. I guess that's a great way to put it, right?
Yeah. And to piggyback on what Michelle's saying, reason for the number concern is that you have to look at the incident dynamics, as I mentioned. If you evacuate a neighborhood now, you don't have residents that primarily need shelter. They just need a warm, dry, safe place to go. So hopefully school-age kids are in school, people are at work, people can go other places during the day. As it approaches 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's when one of the mindsets of a critical decision maker is going to be, am I going to have this event resolved in the next 2 or 3 hours so I don't impact somebody's potential dinner preparations or food? So when you're around meal periods, that's when the conversation gets a little bit more critical when you're deciding whether you need to create or have a shelter operation. 4 o'clock in the afternoon onward, chances are it's going to be a shelter operation. For you in law enforcement that have to displace people in the middle of the night, it's a given. As you deal with the fact that most kids are now back in school, Again, your sweep of time is very narrow when you're not really considering a shelter. Saturday afternoon, you have a bad person somewhere and you need to clear people out while you deal with it. You can just open that evacuation site. You can send them to the library or something. You don't really need to look at a shelter until you get closer to about 2 hours out from your meal periods. And that's really one of those critical decision-making comments that Michelle was alluding to.
Cool. So as we're still in that authority to activate, we talked about those triggers, those clues from the incident that will drive us to those decision makers to make that decision. The next thing we're going to talk about is that actual decision to activate. So you have the incident that occurs. If you'll notice, the first paragraph starting out on this decision to activate is we, again, reference that ARC MOU. And so if you don't have that in place, then you're going to go ahead and need to delete that language. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record on this, but you want to get that MOU in place as quickly as possible. And so you're going to have the advantage here to talk with a rep and get that set up. Now you notice this page there's a bit more information than most of the other pages that we've seen previously in filling out information. And that's the reason because when we're talking about, we said there's a couple different situations where you could have a shelter activated. We've got the ARC activated shelter where they're activating it. They give you a cursory advisory, a notification about it, but your city is not really involved except for maybe ARC might ask you for some resources, but you're not really involved in that care and shelter site operation. Now, you could have a situation where the field, smaller events, and I don't know about your jurisdiction, in smaller events, our incident commanders or our unified commanders could make the decision to activate a shelter. Now, I want to stop here for a second because a lot of people get confused. There's a difference between the person that makes the decision to activate a shelter and the person that carries out the shelter operation. Get that? So if you have a unified command that says, you know what, we're evacuating people and we're going to need to open up a shelter, there's one of two things that are going to happen. They're going to go ahead and they're going to call out somebody to come and respond to the field to sit in the unified command or the incident command post structure, and that person will be responsible for managing that shelter component. And we don't know who that is yet. We're going to leave that generic at this point. Or unified command is going to pick up the phone and they're going to call the emergency operations center if you have that. Or maybe they're going to call, I don't know if your jurisdiction, your departments have what's called a department operations center. For example, in the city of LA, our Rec and Parks has a department operations center. So the field command will definitely call the Rec and Parks DOC, okay, when they decide to activate a shelter. If the EOC is activated, then they might call the EOC. So we have to think of what could possibly as next steps. We saw the triggers, we're going to make a decision to activate. How could this unfold? What would this might look like? So if field command is going to retain the responsibility for a care and shelter operation, then somehow or another that care and shelter operation or that function has to be embedded into the ICS organization. And it's usually in your operations section. So a lot of times you'll see if a field command activates and they're going to retain the responsibility for activating a shelter, then they'll bring in a mass care branch director under operations. Or worse scenario, because the premise of the incident command system is if you don't fill a position, the next higher position retains that responsibility, is your operations section chief would be responsible for oversight of a care and shelter site. Why you would do that in the middle of an incident, is beyond me, but you would need to make sure that if you are retaining that oversight on a shelter site or operation, a care and shelter site, that function needs to be embedded in the organization. The way that it's handled is you call in somebody from a lead department in your jurisdiction to respond to the command post. A lot of jurisdictions don't have that in place, but that would be the most effective application of incident command to really oversee a care and shelter site. Does that make sense? So if field command is going to say, okay, we're not, the EOC isn't activated and we're going to, that shelter is attached to our emergency operations, then you embed a position in your incident command system. So I'll give you an example. In the city of Los Angeles, if it's just field command and a lot of times we didn't activate the EOC. We would have a field command and then Rec and Parks would activate their department operations center. They would send a representative to go and fill the mass care branch director position in field command. So with that representative sitting in the organization, can care and shelter be managed from the field? Yes, because you have the function embedded in the incident command system. If you don't have, you could actually maybe have a Rec and Parks representative that has to respond to a shelter site because your jurisdiction's so small. You don't have enough staff. Somehow or another, you've got to connect. If the EOC isn't activated, that representative at the shelter somehow has to connect with field command to stay in communication because that shelter operation is part of the overall jurisdictional response, right? So you could have a situation where field command is going to manage the shelter, the care and shelter operations, and so it's embedded in the incident command system. You'll notice there's an insert lead department. There's somebody, for example, the last workshop, one of the jurisdictions didn't have a Rec and Parks department or division, but they had a community services division, and they were responsible for activating shelter sites and all those operations. So a representative from that department would respond to the command post. So that's your first situation. Now, most of us know that, to take that pressure off of field command, because they're really focused on that life safety, those activities and those response tasks that are really related to the incident response, is a lot of times we'll activate our emergency operations center. And I know a lot of you, your emergency operations center is pretty small. It's probably maybe a few people, it may be a room. But remember, when we talk about response, we're talking about functions. A lot of times we refer to positions, but it really is about functions. So if you're going to have your EOC managing your care and shelter capability or your function, then somewhere in that EOC organization, somebody has to be tasked with the oversight of care and shelters, and we'll talk about that. Now, there's two types of shelters. Even if you've activated your EOC, most of the time, our shelters, because American Red Cross is our key partner for sheltering. And so most of the time, American Red Cross is going to be at our shelter, and they're going to pretty much lead the operations and the processes at that shelter. We're still going to have to provide city personnel some type of support. Like I said, in our city, American Red Cross does most of the processes in our shelters, but our Rec and Parks still sits in the shelter management organization. We'll still have some security support by LAPD or maybe even DOT with traffic officers. So the city is still providing some kind of resource support and some kind of services support to an ARC managed shelter. Okay, that's a shelter where ARC primarily has the whole management oversight. But you could have a situation, and I referred to it a little bit earlier, where you have a 7.8 catastrophic earthquake. American Red Cross, like all of our organizations across the region, is going to be stretched very thin, and their ability to assign resources across the whole region or the whole county is going to be very stretched. They're going to be in the same boat we are. So you might be activating a shelter where it's all city managed, that you're managing it, you're sitting in the shelter management organization, and not only that, you're providing all the services and the resources, and you have to plan for that. And so this plan kind of describes how you're going to go about those two types of scenarios. The good news is that 85 to 90% of the time we're going to be working with American Red Cross in almost all of our hazards. But you still have to write in this plan that you're going to address those. So that's why you see the language under EOC, ARC managed, and then you have EOC managed. Okay? And one of the things that we talk about for the EOC is in the very, very bottom, we're really actually starting to identify what department and what position sits in our EOC that has the responsibility. Because if nothing else in your plan, we're going to have roles and responsibilities, but there is definitely a lead division, department, or even a person. One of our other jurisdictions in the last workshop, it was one person that was responsible. They're going to be the ones that you need to identify them as that person in the EOC that's responsible. That's what a plan does, is it gives the reader a good idea. Okay, if we activate a shelter, this is who makes the decision. These are our triggers. This is the position in the field command that's going to be managing it if it stays with the field. This is the position that's going to be managing it in the EOC if it's going to be EOC managed. And down at the very, very bottom there, I just give you some organizations that definitely might sit in your EOC. This isn't required. So you might want to have a spot for American Red Cross to send a representative. A lot of times they'll provide you a representative if they have the staffing resources. Another thing is your local school district, and we're going to talk about the use of schools for sheltering, because there is some things that need to be considered when using schools. But you would want to put that there, and then your animal services department. But again, that bulleted list is just recommendations. If you don't have all of those, you're just going to put in what applies to your jurisdiction under that. So you can kind of see this first section here is kind of lengthy, okay? And if the question that I just ask is, does your EOC have a seat in it for schools? If you don't, you might want to, we're going to talk about memorandums of agreement, memorandums of understanding, but a lot of times jurisdictions will use schools as kind of a last option for a shelter site, because there's restrictions. You're going to want to sit down with your local school district agency or whoever your agency is and develop a memorandum of understanding with them also, because they're not under your authority as a jurisdiction. Okay? So the rest of this is pretty much straightforward, and we're going to take a break here in a second. The next section really is a bulleted list of what American Red Cross provides in support. You don't need to change anything on that. American Red Cross actually provided that list. The city support, you want to review all those bullets and make sure that they apply, that those are actually things that you are providing. But I will tell you that the bulleted services and what should be at least your minimum that you provide for care and shelter sites. But you can take a look at those. And then the county support list, the county has actually reviewed those, and they have confirmed that that's what they provide. So you don't need to make any change on that. So one of the things I want to backtrack just for a second, it'll only take us a minute, and I want to go back to page 22. When we talked about the different places that decision to activate might occur, we talked about it could occur at the field. And one of the reasons that we stressed, for example, we stressed that, so you have an incident that happens and you have field command and they anticipate a need for sheltering. They make the decision to go ahead and keep the sheltering operations under their command in the incident command structure. That means that they're responsible for all the tactical operations that are going on in the shelter, and therefore if they're responsible for the tactical operations, they're going to need to embed something in their organization that manages it. For those of you who have taken incident command system, you know that your organization is always attached to goals and objectives. So if you have an objective to manage a care and shelter site and it stays under the field command, then you have to embed something in the organization. But, for example, sometimes in the city of LA, we had an incident, say a fast-moving wildfire, where field command is looking at the immediate, suppression of the incident, immediate evacuations. Well, we're well experienced enough to know in the emergency management department, you know what? This wildfire has all the potential. It's going to move people. We already know and can anticipate that. So we'll activate the EOC, and it'll either be the EOC or the Rec and Parks Department Operations Center that will talk to Unified Command, coordinate, but may make that decision to activate a shelter at the EOC. So that's why we've kind of tried to cover a couple different situations in this information in the plan, So readers of the plan can kind of know, hey, this isn't a one. We all know incidents evolve and there's a lot of different things that can go in different directions. So describing these 3 types of how a care and shelter site could be activated and managed really gives you some flexibility in your plan. We know that most of the time the decision to activate the shelter, the site, the care and shelter site, may occur initially at field command, but most of the time an EOC or something's going to be activated to support the field and move that operation of the shelter away from a field command that really needs to focus on the priority of protecting life, stabilizing the incident, and some basic public safety response activities. So we just wanted to let you know to think about that, and that's how the different ways that the care and shelter decision to activate a care and shelter site. But when we start to move into the operational responsibility, sorry Dave, I didn't close it, so it's still only at 1. They're tracking, they've actually taken a pool against me back there. So when we talk about the initial direction and management, we're going to talk about a situation where the EOC is activated in the EOC, or maybe it's a department operations center. Most everybody knows that when we talk about a DOC, it's still a coordination center, right? How many people are familiar with the role of a coordination center? That you're not directly over tactical operations, you serve a support function to whatever is going on under field command. So a department operations center could be an activated support center. But anyway, so we're going to talk about initial direction and management. Okay. So if you notice, the first thing that we kind of describe out is if the EOC's initial direction and control and the initial management if it's under the direction of the EOC. Those bullets are pretty straightforward. In reading them, most of it's insert position. Now you're going to start to see a reference to EOC positions. And so this is where you're going to have to stop and you're going to have to think about, okay, if we activate the EOC and the EOC is providing that coordination support over the shelter to support people that are being evacuated, who sits in that position? What's the lead department? And what position do they fill? Because you need to place that into your plan. You're going to notice that that lead department for care and shelter functions in your jurisdiction, that department is identified a number of different times. So once you fill it in here, you're just going to be able to put it in other places. If you don't have a department in your jurisdiction that's responsible for that, you need to start looking at having a department or a position in the city that's going to be has the operational, what we call the operational responsibility for oversight of care and shelter capability in your city. Now you notice I didn't say it was the responsibility to make the decision. It was the operational responsibility moving forward after a decision is made to now proceed and carry out that oversight of care and shelter operation. Did you want to add anything?
So I just want to jump in here. So Michelle is spot on, and it's really incumbent on you folks to get comfortable with your jurisdictional organization. A lot of times people know their department really well and the ones that they work out with or work on a common basis. A number of the cities in here looking at the roster are known as contract cities. So your fire service, EMS, and your law enforcement, you contract with either LA County Sheriff on that side or LA County Fire for their services. Your relationship with those two entities as a city is by contract and agreement. So it isn't a full menu or catalog depending on what the contract says. The expectation that you might have for what they're going to do needs to be evaluated and known as you build your plan. So that, make a note to say, city manager or whoever handles your contracts and agreements, let's talk about what our agreement is with those entities if we're a contract city. If you have your own fire service and or own law enforcement, they are within your existing government structure. You're in a different place as far as managing that.
Right. Okay, so just to backtrack a little bit, We've gone from the incident happening, we've gone to the triggers, those clues in the incident that are going to kind of start us to think about, okay, we need to make a decision on whether we're going to open up a care and shelter site or we're not. We talked about that initial decision to activate. That could be either ARC makes the decision, or Field Command is going to make that decision, or it might be the EOC. But once that decision to activate occurs, what we're going to see now is that this transition of this operational responsibility to the Emergency Operations Center or to whatever coordination point that you have established in your city. The remainder of the concept of operations is what we're really going to do is we're going to review considerations that you need to think about when we talk about care and shelter.
Good morning. My name is John Spiatwich, Los Angeles County Department of Public Social Services, 33 years, 18 years in emergency management. And just real quick before I move on. So for the county, they selected Public Social Services as the coordinator for mass care and shelter. Even though I think Parks and Recreation will be better, because they have the facilities that we're going to use as shelter sites. We don't have it. So that's where it's like, it really is a partnership. We can't do it alone without them. We can't do it without public health, mental health, DCFS, Children and Family Services, WEDAX, all these other departments that really support us. But a key component would be Red Cross, because Red Cross helps support local government in fulfilling local government's responsibility, providing mass care and shelter for our residents. So that partnership is so critical with all the players.
Ashu Palta with the LA County Office of Emergency Management. I have 20 years in the county service and 12 years in emergency management. So our office is primarily responsible for the coordination and communication, kind of like what John was saying. There's various other departments that have key roles. Our job is to make sure we're interfacing and make sure everybody's on the same page, not only with the county family, but also with the whole operational area. So that includes all 88 cities, our nonprofit partners, and our private entities that will be assisting.
And so I'll do a slightly fuller introduction. Again, I'm Michael Edwards. I formerly was with the Red Cross. Don't worry about it. Your local representative, and I believe she's en route here or will be here this afternoon, Chris Campbell J., for those of you who are familiar with her, she is your localized point of contact for Red Cross activities and services. She will be the person that helps facilitate how you get access to Red Cross services. Without doubt, she'll have the information that you need to be complete. There'll be questions about the MOU process. She'll put you in contact with that. That is not a scary process. There's a lot of boilerplate, like this template that goes into that. We do MOUs across the nation very similarly, so you need not worry about that. We'll have a conversation about potential shelter sites in your jurisdiction and your relationships with school districts, which Michelle's going to get into in a little bit. So your Red Cross partnership is just that. It is the partnership to make you successful. It's going to be an easy lift. It's not going to be onerous on you. They'll do most of it, and out of it you get free training at your site. So when Chris gets here, we'll talk more about it, and I'll be around to answer questions on their behalf if she doesn't make it.
Great, perfect. And I will tell you, I've worked with each of these individuals over a number of years, and the expertise and the knowledge, and really, we're going to reference what their organizations and agencies do through a number of the plan, but Ashu and John and Mike, their expertise is phenomenal. So not to lay a burden, they aren't going to give you their 24/7 phone numbers, but definitely just, talk to them, meet up with them, get their contact information, because a lot of times they can actually give you some answers via email or point you in the right direction, because both of these individuals are extremely knowledgeable and I was blessed to have them review this plan. I will tell you, I was very lucky, because as I told you, there's no one person that knows it all, and without their help, I could not have made a completely effective template for you. So I personally want to thank them so much, because their expertise was invaluable. So, and you can give me the $20 after lunch. No, seriously, invaluable. And I was really blessed that I got the three individuals. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to roll through these considerations, and I'm briefly going to touch on them, and starting with that, I already did the initial direction. So you kind of see how the incident's kind of evolving. Now we're at the EOC, and the EOC is going to take over that overall responsibility and accountability for that care and shelter function. Maybe just a care site, you know, maybe just food and water point of distribution. Maybe it's just going to be a local assistance center activation. Maybe it's going to be a shelter operation, people are overnight, or maybe it's just going to be some temporary location where people can stay until they can be returned to their homes. But the EOC is now, that accountability is transitioned to the EOC. So the first thing that needs to be done is there needs to be a site evaluation. Now we all know that probably a lot of jurisdictions have pre-established sites that they can use as shelter facilities. But when you decide to activate a specific location as a care and shelter site, you're going to need to go and evaluate that site ahead of time. And the good news is that we actually have checklists that are already in place. American Red Cross has a very excellent shelter evaluation checklist. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we've provided that for you. And we're going to go over the checklists and what's available as resources for you. But you're going to need to go out and do that site evaluation, selection, and activation. The good news is American Red Cross is our partner, and a lot of times they participate in that site evaluation. Definitely when you're looking at site evaluation, that accessibility requirement is a mandate. Now, the thing with accessibility is I'm not going to go into ADA accessibility for shelter locations. There's actually guidance. And how many pages is it? Have you seen it, Mike? It's
a little bit.
It's like 30 to 40 pages. It's pretty extensive. So what I'm going to heartily recommend is that you all find that guidance, or if you have an ADA liaison in your city, work with them closely and go out and do that accessibility inspection on your sites ahead of time as a preparedness activity. But one of the things that you may have to do is you may have to activate a shelter, and let's say it's not 100% accessible at that point in time, doesn't meet all the ADA accessibility requirements. There are temporary measures that you can put in place. For example, a temporary ramp. And knowing what those temporary measures that you can put in place for a facility is really helpful. So my recommendation, we didn't put it in this particular manual for you. It actually might be in that inclusive document. I haven't had a chance to read it from cover to cover. They might talk about how you can do that temporary, but the ADA accessibility guidance for shelters, it's definitely in there. What you can do for temporary measures. And we all know that a lot of our facilities are like, they were built, 20, 30 years ago. They don't meet all the current requirements, but there are go-arounds, so you want to take a look at that. Did you want to add anything to?
So part of that relationship you have with the Red Cross is that they will come out and work with you to survey your facilities, give you those answers. We have a very, very nice national standard checklist that talks about accessibility, water fountain placement, whether you have backup generators, food service, all that lovely information you need. So again, pulling that partnership with the Red Cross in gives you another big tool to do all that for free. Operative word. Now, there is staff time to go with them and walk around, but that will give you that catalog that you can add to your plan as an appendices. It tells you if we had to use this facility as a shelter. Okay, you need so much square footage per person for a shelter, for a cot, and the space around it. You also need a lower number if you're just evacuating people. So having that information ahead of time can help your incident commanders or your department operations centers or your EOCs make those appropriate decisions when things are busy and you don't want to guess. So again, Michelle and I are going to repeat this a lot. Get that relationship with the Red Cross, work together to pull that together, and you will be a lot happier when the phone rings at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning.
So, and some of these recommendations I'm only making to you as recommendations, but it's from some hard lessons that we learned in the city under litigation circumstances is that we've been stressing American Red Cross as our partner. And we know that they are going to come with a really great package when they come and they oversee our shelter operations. But here's the challenge is, remember I talked to you, there could be times, think catastrophic, when you might activate a city shelter, an American Red Cross may not be available. So, if you depend on American Red Cross for all of your resources and they aren't able to come, what happens with your shelters? And hold on one second and I'll get with you so I'll lose this thought. So if the challenge for all of us, and believe me, we had the same challenge, is there has to be some type of strategic planning for you to at least have some resiliency locally to activate a shelter. And what that may mean is looking at opportunities to either partner with organizations that are within your jurisdiction. Okay, that maybe can provide you resources. Or maybe you have to set up shelter catches, pre-staged trailers with catches. What happened with us when we came out of the litigation is it was identified that we didn't have available resources for worst case scenario. So we looked for grant funds and we applied for grant funds and were able to purchase just some basic shelter supplies like cots and wheelchairs and put them into trailers and have them available in case we were the ones and it was a city managed shelter. So, and I'm not telling you that you're mandated, and it's a challenge for all of us because there's only so much money, but that is how our capability is looked at nowadays. Is if we're a local jurisdiction, if American Red Cross is unable to support our shelter, we're still accountable. Under the laws, we're still accountable for providing those services. So how do we do that? Maybe you form agreements with your other jurisdictions around you and you all purchase a couple shelter catches and you share those if you can. There's a lot of different strategies to address that, and I'm not going to go into them here, but you have to think about the city managed shelters where American Red Cross is unable to provide those resources. How are you going to activate